Personal boundaries are the limits and guidelines we establish within our relationships. People with strong boundaries can say no when needed while still embracing vulnerability and fostering deep connections with others. If navigating personal boundaries is challenging for you, the first step towards growth involves identifying your individual boundary style. In today's episode of Therapy Tidbits, we'll explore the 3 distinct personal boundary styles and review their primary characteristics. This exploration will aid in recognizing your own boundaries and pinpointing areas where you can grow. First, let's talk about what we all would like to believe we have, and that is healthy boundaries. The hallmark of someone who has healthy boundaries is that they are judicious about who they let in and who they keep out. They understand that trust and emotional intimacy with others is important, but that it takes time to build, and not everyone is going to be worthy of cultivating that with. They share personal information appropriately, and they are able to say no when needed. People with healthy boundaries are happy to help others, but they're not going to do it at their own detriment. They value both their own opinions and the opinions of others. So they're not going to be my way or the highway kind of people, but they also aren't going to just go along with anything, especially if it compromises their personal values. They realize that conflict is a normal and necessary part of life, and they are able to navigate it effectively. If I had to summarize healthy boundaries in one word, it would be balance. They're balancing their own needs and their own inner peace with the needs of other people, resulting in them having close, mutually fulfilling relationships. Now let's talk about rigid boundaries. This is going to be somebody who has a lot of walls up around them. If you have rigid boundaries, you're not going to be very comfortable with intimacy and getting close to people, and you're going to feel most comfortable when you can keep emotional distance from others. If you have rigid boundaries, you may be hesitant to ask for help and prefer to be overly self-reliant. You're probably very protective of personal information and don't tend to disclose much about yourself. The people around you may perceive you as hard to read or difficult to get to know. People with rigid boundaries can come across as very cold, and this can cause problems when they get into romantic relationships. They tend to be very detached and want to keep their partners at an arm's length. While it can be easy to assume people with rigid boundaries are just unfriendly, the underlying motivation for this behavior tends to be about a fear of vulnerability and rejection. And while having rigid boundaries may protect you from emotional pain, it also impedes the development of meaningful connections and can result in loneliness and isolation. Lastly, let's talk about porous boundaries. These are going to be individuals who struggle to maintain a clear distinction between themselves and others. For example, they may overshare personal information or disclose intimate details about their life to strangers at inappropriate times. People with porous boundaries typically have a difficult time saying no, setting limits, or declining requests. And this leads to them often feeling overwhelmed and burnt out. They also tend to become overly involved in other people's problems. They might be the kind of people who need to fix everything for everybody, even if it's to their own detriment. People with porous boundaries may also be dependent on the opinions of others and seek excessive external validation in order to feel good about themselves. Something that can be really concerning with porous boundaries is that these individuals might be willing to accept abuse or disrespect. This is usually driven by a fear of rejection if they don't comply with other people's expectations. Trying to please everyone doesn't work in the long run, and people with porous boundaries often end up feeling exhausted, resentful, and this ends up causing major problems in their life and in their relationships. Now that you understand the 3 boundary styles, keep in mind most people have a mix of different boundary types. For example, you could have healthy boundaries at work, porous boundaries with your romantic partner, and a mix of all 3 with your family. The appropriateness of boundaries depends heavily on the setting. What's appropriate to say when you are out with your friends might not hit the same when you're at work, for example. If you want to develop healthier boundaries, you need to develop self-awareness and start reflecting on your current boundary style in order to identify areas for improvement. From there, you've got to commit to setting and following through with boundaries that align with your personal goals and values. And while changing long-standing patterns can be difficult, learning to set healthy boundaries can do wonders for your emotional well-being and your relationships. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.